This is our teaching video for the second Sunday in Lent, March the 1st, 2015. In this video we're going to talk about Abram and his wife Sarai, and I'm going to walk you through where they came from and talk a little bit about how long it takes for their call to be realized, and that is an example of trusting in God and God's promises. And really the majority of this video is going to be on crucifixion and the cross, because in the reading on Sunday Jesus talks about dying, Jesus talks about suffering, Jesus talks about having to pick up the cross and follow him if you want to be one of his disciples. And I think a lot of us find our place with Simon Peter saying, no, God, we don't want to go there. We want to go somewhere else. So we need to talk about crucifixion. I do want to say there are some graphic pictures which will be included at the end of this video. Those are not meant to be intentionally discomforting or grotesque, but after considering it, I felt it was important that if at the heart of our religion is a man who's murdered on a cross, that we're able to talk about it and not just skirt it with nice paintings or with a kind of sanitized picture of what it actually is. A reminder, this is the journey Abram and Sarai took. They start here in Ur, go up to Haran, come to Canaan, end up in Egypt during a time of famine, end up back here. Shechem and Bethel are two famous cities. In this week's reading, we hear that Abram's name becomes Abraham. So Abram means exalted father. Abraham means father of many. Sarai becomes Sarah. The word Sarah means princess. Sarai, some people say, means princess, that her name is basically unchanged. In other places, Sarai means argumentative. So depending on how you feel about it, and probably depending on the day she had, you might pick either of those meanings. What we want to say, and one reason she has every right to be argumentative, is a reminder that Abram doesn't receive his call until he's 75 years old. So his main calling and the deepest purpose of his life and the deepest purpose of Abram as it relates to history doesn't happen until he's 75. Now if you remember, after they come and leave everything, they leave family, they leave property, everything they have, they end up going to Egypt, they end up meeting King Abimelech, and in both cases, Abram essentially pimps out Sarai for his own protection. So here, if you can imagine them leaving everything, and then they end up in these times of great difficulty, and she's probably looking at him saying, why did we ever leave Ur? When he's 86, they have the child Ishmael, and of course now after 11 years of hardship, they're like, well, if this thing's going to happen, we're going to be the ones that have to do it. And of course that ends up being an understandable decision, but it's not God's decision. And finally, in the reading that we have on Sunday, they have their names changed, and they have the promise again of being the father of many. So this is where we can say they become Abraham and Sarah. And notice, this is 24 years after they left. So it's not like they left and then it was like 6 months later they have the fulfillment of the promise. 24 years have passed, and not until Abraham now is 100, is the child Isaac born. So imagine, they leave everything here. Imagine leaving everything at the age of 75, going through a time of great difficulty, which causes stress in your marriage, among other things. The child Ishmael's born to Hagar, and all the trouble that caused. And only when they're 100 years old, or at least Abraham's 100, do they get what they wanted. Now, one of the things that Paul will say on Sunday is, no distrust made Abraham waver concerning the promise of God, but he grew strong in his faith as he gave glory to God, being fully convinced that God was able to do what he had promised. What Paul wants us to remember is none of this matters. What matters is that God does what he promises. And if we believe that God does what he's promised, that's faith, and that faith is reckoned as righteousness. All right, we want to turn our attention now to the cross and crucifixion. As I said just a couple minutes ago, there will be some graphic images at the end of this video. I initially struggled with whether to include them or not, but decided again we don't need a sanitized picture of the crucifixion, but we need it in all its ugliness to really capture why it was that Peter wasn't so sure he wanted to go there with Jesus, why it is that Jesus ends up on the cross alone, and why it is that we struggle if we actually understand what God is saying with the call to take up our cross and follow too. On your screen right now is the only archaeological evidence that we've found of crucifixion. And it doesn't mean that crucifixion didn't happen. It just means a lot of stuff wasn't left out. What this is, as you can tell, this is the model, and this is the actual bone. They found the ankle bone of a man, and the nail was bent in such a way, they think it may have hit a knot in the wood of the cross, that they couldn't pull it out, because oftentimes they would recycle these nails. And so very few of them have been found intact because they were pulled out, but this one couldn't be. Now you don't really see it here, but there was also this piece of wood and that would keep the body on the cross so that the nail couldn't be pulled through the foot, and also it kind of disperses the surface area. The man who was crucified, they think, was crucified like this. His arms are tied because they didn't find evidence that his hands had been nailed in this grave site. And then his feet were probably nailed to the side of the cross through his ankle. Now, if you think of art that you've seen from the crucifixion, you say, well, that doesn't look like what I've seen. But if you read ancient accounts of crucifixion, say from someone like Josephus, you find out there were 100 different ways to crucify a person. And when the historian Josephus is watching the destruction of Jerusalem, he actually watches Roman soldiers crucifying people, one way and one another way, just for fun. So he watches Roman soldiers crucifying people in grotesque ways and getting joy out of it. This is actually a person you should know, Flavius Josephus, who wrote a very famous history because he worked with the Romans during the time of their conquest. There's a famous story of Josephus seeing three people the Romans had crucified. He recognizes them as old friends. He goes to Titus, who at this time is just a general, later will be the emperor of Rome. He begs for them to be taken down. Titus agrees. He says, take them down and take them to a doctor. They are taken off the crosses and taken to a Roman physician. Two of them succumb to their wounds and die, and the third one recovers. Also a reminder that crucifixion was reserved for criminals and slaves. Roman citizens were not allowed to be crucified, and it was something that was appalling and disgusting to most Roman citizens. Here's a quote from Cicero: "The very mention of the cross should be far removed not only from a Roman citizen's body, but from his mind, his eyes, and his ears." And, of course, Cicero is before the time of Jesus, so he's not talking about Christianity. But a lot of Romans had, at least in the popular memory still, Spartacus and his slave revolt, and the Roman general Crassus, after he defeated Spartacus and his slaves, lined the Appian Way with 6,000 crosses. And so as you walked the road to Rome, there were 6,000 people crucified, and you could see them dying, or you could see their remains as a reminder of the Roman victory, but also as a warning to any slaves that might want to cause another insurrection. One of the questions think we each have to struggle with is, how do we make the cross safe as Christians? Sometimes our crosses are valuable or precious, gold, diamonds, brass, whatever, but sometimes we make the cross innocuous, and that's dangerous. There's actually a collection of jokes from ancient Rome written in Greek called the Philologos, and there's a joke about a man who sees someone he knew who had been a very fast runner. And the fast runner had been crucified, and the man comes up to him and says, "Ah, boy, you used to run fast, and now it appears you're learning how to fly." One of the reasons I'm including that is a reminder to us that humor and art and culture can all sort of take the sting out of what the cross is. And so one of the things I want to do now is look at the cross through a little bit of history, because crucifixion didn't just end with the Romans, and then bring us up to the present time, which will allow us to experience a little bit of the horror of what it is we're talking about. Now, one of the things you may not know is crucifixion actually started being practiced in Japan in the 1600s. And the reason it started being practiced in Japan is because Christian missionaries had come, and the Japanese officials felt it needed to be suppressed. And so there were 26 martyrs who were crucified. And so crucifixion became a regular punishment in Japan for a significant period of time. So here we have the 26 martyrs who were crucified. If you've ever read the novel Silence by Shusaku Endo, it's a great novel about this period of time. The Japanese did a few variations. One of the variations was to put crosses in the sea during low tide, and then high tide would come and almost drown the person, but not quite, and then they would be left alive in the sea as the tides were changing. And so some of the grotesque nature of crucifixion was improved upon, if you will. But very much like Josephus writing about the Romans, once you start crucifying people, then some people come up with all sorts of cruel innovations to keep everybody interested. Now, to move from a fairly distant painting to a more in-your-face photograph, this is also from Japan from the 1800s, and this was a person who murdered his employer's son during a robbery, and so he was crucified, and this is around the 1860s. He was not nailed to a cross, but was tied to it, and we see the kind of physical twisting of the body as a person suffers and dies on a cross. So crucifixion is something that actually was used as a form of capital punishment in Japan through that time. Now on your screen here is actually a scene from a documentary from 1919 about the Armenian genocide. So if you remember all the Armenians who were killed in Turkey in the first quarter of the 20th century, and that's actually where the word genocide was coined, to try and come up with a word to describe what had happened to the Armenians. This is from a story of Armenian girls being raped and crucified, and this is part of the historical record. And in fact, the person whose testimony this scene of the movie was based on saw it and said, well, actually, this isn't how the Turks crucified the women that I saw. Rather than crucifying them on these kind of Western crosses, they were raped and then they were actually impaled, and they were impaled through their genitals. And they said, but America had to make it cleaner because even in the movies, they couldn't handle the truth of what I've seen. So there's a sense of which what happened to these Armenian women was so gruesome that even to read about it and to hear it described is to be sickened. This is actually an Orthodox bishop who was visiting the Crimea and Sebastopol, and this is during the time of the Bolshevik Revolution. He was visiting this church, St. Vladimir's Cathedral, when he was crucified in the church by Bolsheviks. And very much like St. Peter, this is the inside of the church. He was crucified on these doors, called the royal doors, and behind this is the altar in the Orthodox Church. And like St. Peter, he was crucified upside down. So the reason I include him and the Armenians is to remind us that this is something that happened even in the 20th century. Apart from the experience of crucifixion in the early part of the 20th century, we also had the Shroud of Turin being examined scientifically. So if any of you have ever been to a service where they talk about the physiological effect of crucifixion, a lot of that came out of the fact that a French army surgeon from World War I was approached by the church who wanted to verify whether in fact the Shroud of Turin contained the body of a crucified man, hopefully Jesus, and how that experience of crucifixion worked. And if you've never seen the Shroud of Turin, here's the person's legs, here's his arm, here's his other arm, his hands, here's his face, and then here's the same image because it was folded here in the middle. The person who took on the experimentation was a French doctor named Pierre Barbet, and he actually took the cadavers of unclaimed bodies in Paris, and he started by crucifying them to see physiologically what would happen to them. Because he needed live subjects, he went from nailing bodies to strapping bodies and getting a sense of what was happening to people's bodies if in fact they were crucified. And the reason I'm sharing this with you is anyone who's ever been in a service where this has been described or a Bible study, a lot of this information came from Barbet and his research. One of the things that comes out of his research and also looking at the Shroud of Turin, whether it's Jesus or not, the person in it was crucified. And so normally we have this picture, but there's good evidence that the person who was crucified was actually crucified in this manner, thus asphyxiating him. Or another theory is that the person who was crucified in the Shroud of Turin, the wounds would say that the person was shaped like this on the cross. So now we're getting close to what did Jesus look like as he was hanging on the cross. Well, one of the disturbing things that we're hearing currently, and if we've wondered about the experience of crucifixion, is that people in Syria are being crucified by ISIS and also as part of the Syrian civil war, including children. So here is a picture that appeared in the news of a man in Syria who had been crucified. It is my understanding that a lot of these people were killed first and then hung up after. This haunting picture appeared in the news also, and it seems to me very close to some of the pictures we see of Jesus. A person who is abused, a person who is killed, a person who hangs and dies and is rejected. Now, as I mentioned to you, I struggled with whether to include those images or not, but I felt it was important because if in fact the central act of our salvation is this brutal murder of a person hanging on a cross, we only understand Peter's reluctance and in fact insistence not to go if we understand what we're talking about. When we hear what Josephus said, when we hear what Cicero said, when we hear about the testimony of the Armenian genocide, the bishop who was killed by the Bolsheviks, and now even in Syria and with ISIS, all of this is a sign of this is the world God enters and this is the power God has to break. This is the suffering, humiliation, and death that Jesus experiences so that the light of Easter shines all the more brightly. May God give us courage to follow in the way.